I have always thought of myself as a logical, rational man. Working as a scientist, my life was centered on research and experiments. Most of my days, and often nights, were spent in the lab. My work was demanding, but I believed I had managed to build the right balance at home with my wife, Emily. Emily did not work outside the home, choosing instead to manage the house, a role she seemed to enjoy. To help ease her load, I hired a driver named Ryan, who could handle errands and take Emily wherever she needed to go. Ryan was a trustworthy guy, in his early 30s, with a calm demeanor that put me at ease. He had been working for us for about a year, and I never had a reason to doubt him. Emily seemed content, always cheerful when I returned home, and our life appeared to be blissful. Emily and I had been married for 7 years, and in all that time, I had never doubted her loyalty. Our days followed a steady pattern. I would leave for the lab early in the morning and come back in the evening, always welcomed by Emily's warm smile and a carefully prepared dinner. On weekends, we often spent time with friends, went for walks, or enjoyed quiet evenings at home. It was a simple, peaceful life that I thought was built on mutual trust and love. If I had one big blind spot, it was probably that I trusted too easily. I was convinced our life was perfect. I was so focused on my work, believing that my dedication and the life we had together were enough to keep Emily happy. She had everything she could need, a beautiful home, financial security, and the freedom to spend her days however she pleased. I had always assumed that if anything was bothering her, she would let me know. She was my partner, my confidant, and I could not imagine her keeping any significant secrets from me. Little did I know, there was trouble brewing beneath the surface, and everything I believed was about to be upended. Emily and Ryan had become friends, a relationship I had naively assumed was purely friendly. Emily often mentioned how helpful and polite he was, and I never gave it a second thought. Ryan would drive her to do the grocery shopping, attend her yoga classes, and even meet friends for the occasional lunch. I thought of this as a good thing, believing it gave Emily more time to relax and enjoy herself. Life carried on in what seemed like perfect harmony. My research was progressing, and Emily appeared happier than ever. We had fallen into a comfortable routine, and I never questioned her outings with Ryan because she would share the details of her day with me, painting a picture that kept any suspicions at bay. One afternoon, I decided to leave the lab earlier than usual, wanting to surprise Emily with dinner at her favorite restaurant. I thought it would be a nice change and an opportunity for us to reconnect. I tried calling her, but she did not pick up. This was not unusual, as she could have been busy or out with friends. As I drove home, I noticed Ryan's car parked at the far end of our street, partially hidden by some trees. This was odd, as he usually left after dropping Emily off. My curiosity stirred, and I decided to take a closer look. As I approached, I saw that the car's windows were fogged up, and a sinking feeling hit my stomach. I tried to brush it off, telling myself there was probably a logical reason. But when I got close enough to see inside, my world fell apart. There, in the back seat, was Emily, wrapped in Ryan's arms in a passionate embrace. Anger and betrayal surged through me so powerfully that, for a moment, I was paralyzed. My perfect life, my trust, everything I believed in, shattered in that single instant. I pulled open the car door, and they scrambled to cover themselves, their faces full of shock and guilt. "What is going on here?" I demanded, my voice trembling with rage. Instead of apologizing, Emily looked at me defiantly. "Why are you here?" she snapped, her tone full of annoyance rather than remorse. "Do you not have work to do?" Ryan started to say something, but I stopped him cold. "Get out," I commanded, my voice cold as steel. "Both of you. Now." Emily climbed out, hurriedly straightening her clothes. "You never have time for me," she hissed. "You are always at the lab." I needed someone who was actually there. Her words cut deep, but they only fueled my anger further. "So, this is how you handle it?" I replied, barely able to contain my fury. "By cheating on me with the driver." She rolled her eyes, her defiance only fanning the flames. "Maybe if you paid more attention to me, I would not have to." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. This woman I had trusted, loved, and provided for was standing there, putting the blame on me for her betrayal. I turned and walked back to the house, my mind a whirlwind of anger and confusion. How could she do this to me? How could Ryan betray my trust like this? As I reached the door, I heard the sound of their car speeding off, disappearing down the street. I had no idea where they went, but it did not matter. My mind was now on what I needed to do next. I slammed the door behind me and headed straight for the kitchen, needing a place to sit down and gather my thoughts. I dropped into a chair at the dining table, staring blankly at the polished wood as the events of the past hour replayed in my head. Divorce crossed my mind, but it felt too easy, too straightforward. I needed more than just a legal separation, I wanted justice. I had loved Emily deeply, and her betrayal demanded more than a simple parting. My thoughts began swirling with ideas, each more vengeful than the last, as images of various compounds and chemicals from my lab drifted through my mind. I had access to a variety of substances that could cause discomfort or embarrassment without any lasting harm. I knew I had to approach this carefully. Whatever I did needed to be carefully planned and executed perfectly. Letting my emotions control my actions was not an option. Any impulsive decisions could lead to legal consequences, something I could not afford. I wanted revenge, but I also wanted to ensure that Emily would feel the consequences without giving her any advantage if we ended up in court. Emily had always been meticulous about her appearance, especially her skin. She spent considerable money on skincare products and treatments, taking pride in her flawless complexion. The thought of using a compound that could cause severe acne crossed my mind as the ideal revenge. It would strike directly at her vanity, hitting her self-esteem without leaving permanent damage. As I mulled over the idea, a plan started to take shape. I had developed a compound in the lab designed to cause temporary skin irritations, initially intended for testing the effectiveness of new skincare products. In small amounts, it was harmless, but it could lead to intense acne and blemishes for a few weeks. The more I thought about it, the more it seemed like the perfect solution. I could discreetly mix it into her skincare products or even her drinks, triggering a breakout of severe acne. Just as I started to feel some control over the situation, my phone buzzed on the table, pulling me out of my thoughts. It was a message from my boss, Dr. Miller. He rarely contacted me outside of work hours, so I knew it had to be serious. I opened the message, and a fresh wave of anxiety hit me. Urgent. Your presence is required at the lab immediately. Security breach reported, potential loss of sensitive materials. I cursed under my breath. Of all the times for a security issue, it had to be now. I had no choice but to drop everything and handle this immediately. My career and our research's integrity were on the line. My plans for revenge would have to wait. Reluctantly, I grabbed my keys and headed back to the lab, my mind still churning from both the betrayal and the sudden crisis. This unexpected turn had thrown a wrench into my plans, but I was determined not to let it stop me. I would deal with the breach, and then I would make sure Emily paid for what she had done. I drove to the lab, my emotions a storm inside me, simmering just beneath the surface. The betrayal I felt from Emily and Ryan was like a fire threatening to erupt, but I had to focus. The message from Dr. Miller was no small matter, and I could not afford any distractions. When I arrived, the lab was in chaos. Security personnel were everywhere, and my colleagues looked anxious and tense. Dr. Miller spotted me and hurried over, his face grim. "Thank goodness you are here," he said. "Someone accessed the secure storage and took several vials of the new compound. We are still evaluating the damage, but this could be a significant setback." I nodded, trying to shove thoughts of Emily and Ryan to the back of my mind. "Do we know how they got in?" I asked, scanning the room for any obvious signs of forced entry. "Not yet," Dr. Miller replied. "We are reviewing the security footage now. In the meantime, I need you to help with the inventory and see if anything else is missing." I got to work, meticulously checking the shelves and cabinets. As I worked, my mind drifted back to my plan for revenge. I knew exactly where to find the compound that would trigger severe acne. After confirming nothing else was missing in my section, I made my way to the storage room where we kept the experimental compounds. The door was slightly open, a clear sign of the breach. Inside, several vials were missing, but the one I needed was still there, tucked in the corner of the shelf. I discreetly slipped the small, unmarked jar into my pocket, my heart pounding. Taking it was risky, but I was determined to follow through with my plan. Back in the main lab, the security team had identified a suspect on the footage, one of our former interns who had been let go a few weeks earlier. It appeared he had somehow kept his access card and used it to break in. "We will need to contact the authorities," Dr. Miller said, his voice tense. "This could turn into a legal matter." I nodded, already thinking about my own personal crisis. I will finish up the inventory and then head home. Let me know if you need anything else. Dr. Miller gave me a grateful nod. Thank you. Your help is invaluable. When I finally returned home, the house was unusually quiet. The day's events weighed heavily on my mind, but I felt a strange sense of calm. The compound was in my pocket, and my plan was ready to be put into motion. I walked into the kitchen, where Emily sat at the dining table, her eyes red from crying. She looked up as I entered, a mix of guilt and desperation on her face. "Jake, can we talk?" she asked, her voice shaky. I nodded and took a seat across from her. My anger had cooled, replaced by a cold determination. Now, it was a waiting game. "I am sorry for what I said earlier," Emily began, her voice breaking. I was angry and scared, and I lashed out. "I should not have blamed you for what I did." I watched her carefully, nodding as if I understood. "It has been a tough day," I replied, keeping my tone even. "I never saw this coming from you, Emily. I thought we were happy." Tears welled up in her eyes as she reached across the table to take my hand. "I know, and I am so sorry. I made a terrible mistake. Ryan, it just happened. I felt lonely, and he was there, but that does not excuse what." I squeezed her hand, trying to look as if I felt sympathetic. "I understand," I said slowly, "but it will take some time for me to work through this. We both have a lot to work on if we want to make this right." Emily nodded, and I could see relief flood her face. "I want to make it up to you, Jake. I will do whatever it takes," she promised. Forcing a smile, knowing my plan was already underway, I said, "We will take it one day at a time. We can get through this together." Then, testing her willingness to please, I added, "If you really mean that, then you could at least grab me a beer from the fridge." She nodded and headed to the kitchen. As soon as she turned her back, I quickly took the small vial from my pocket and poured the powder into her soup, stirring it just enough to blend it in without being obvious. Emily came back with the beer and sat down. I took a sip and gave her a nod of appreciation. We ate mostly in silence, the tension in the air slowly easing as we finished our meal. Emily seemed genuinely remorseful, and I pretended to be gradually coming to terms with my role in our problems. But deep down, I knew this was only the beginning of my revenge. After dinner, we sat together on the couch, watching a movie as if nothing had happened. Emily leaned against me, her head resting on my shoulder, and for a moment, it felt almost like the old days. But I knew better. The effects of the compound would start to appear in a few days. Each morning that followed felt endless as I observed Emily, anticipating the first signs that the compound was kicking in. I kept to my usual routine, heading to the lab early and returning late, always watching her closely. Emily, on her part, seemed sincere in her efforts to fix our relationship. She was more attentive, more affectionate, and eager to talk through any issues between us. Had it not been for the betrayal fresh in my mind, her efforts might have touched me deeply. Meanwhile, the investigation at the lab continued. The former intern, who had been identified as the culprit, was caught. He claimed he had acted alone out of resentment after being let go. Fortunately, the stolen materials were recovered before they could be sold or used improperly. Security was being tightened, but the ordeal added even more stress to my life, already in turmoil. One afternoon, while passing by the storage room at work, I glanced at the shelf where I had taken the vial that night. My heart nearly stopped when I noticed another bottle just like it sitting right where I had grabbed the first one. With trembling hands, I picked it up. It was the same compound I had used against Emily. But that was impossible. I had taken the only sample, and I was the only one working on it. No one else should have known about it, let alone accessed it. A wave of paranoia hit me. Had someone discovered my plan? Was someone watching me? I quickly pocketed the vial, just as I had done with the first one, making sure to leave no evidence behind. Back in my office, I tried to calm myself, but questions lingered. Had I been careless, or was something more sinister going on? Despite my efforts to focus on work, my mind kept drifting back to the vial. Why was it there? Who could have put it back? The unsettling possibilities gnawed at me. I realized I needed to be extra careful. My plan for Emily was still in play, but I could not afford any slip-ups. Days passed, and I watched Emily for any signs of the compound's effects. Her skin remained clear, and she seemed blissfully unaware of the consequences lurking. Each day felt like a tense waiting game. Finally, the authorities confirmed that all the stolen compounds were accounted for and secure. The intern would face serious legal consequences, and the lab's reputation was protected. With that crisis resolved, I could fully focus on my plan for Emily. A week and a half later, frustration began to creep in. Despite my careful calculations, Emily's skin remained flawless, and she appeared perfectly healthy. Every day I observed her, waiting for some sign the compound was taking effect, but nothing happened. One evening, while we were having dinner, I decided to ask her directly. "So, how are you feeling, Emily? Your skin holding up all right?" She looked at me, puzzled. "I am fine, Jake. My skin is fine too. Why do you ask?" I shrugged, trying to appear casual. "Just checking in. You have been under a lot of stress lately." She nodded, smiling a little. "I appreciate the concern, but honestly, I feel better these days." I forced a smile, but inside, my frustration simmered. Why was the compound not working? Had I miscalculated the dose? As I considered this, Emily suddenly slumped forward, unconscious. "Emily!" I shouted, rushing to her side. I frantically checked her pulse, feeling it faintly. Without hesitation, I called an ambulance. The paramedics arrived quickly, and Emily was whisked away to the hospital. I followed, my mind racing with a mix of fear and confusion. That day, work was calm, so I allowed myself the time to stay by her side, lost in my own swirling thoughts. I focused on Emily, silently praying she would be all right. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor finally approached me. "Mr. Johnson," he asked, his face grim. I stood up, my heart pounding. "Yes, that is me." "How is she?" I asked anxiously. The doctor sighed. "I am afraid I have some difficult news. We found a lethal dose of cyanide in your wife's blood. Cyanide prevents oxygen from entering the bloodstream, which causes a loss of consciousness and, ultimately, death if not treated in time. From what we can determine, the cyanide had been building up in her system gradually, cutting off oxygen over time until she finally collapsed." I felt like the ground had vanished from under me. Cyanide. How was that even possible? But, how? I stammered, struggling to understand. The doctor looked at me with sympathy. "Cyanide is tasteless, odorless, and colorless, similar to some other compounds. It is very possible that she ingested it without knowing. By the time she lost consciousness, it was already too late for us to do anything." I sank into a chair, my mind reeling. The compound I had used to cause acne was also tasteless, odorless, and colorless, but cyanide. That was something entirely different. My plan to make Emily suffer for her betrayal had taken a horrible turn, and now she was gone. As the realization sank in, I was overwhelmed by horror and guilt. Emily's funeral was quiet and somber, attended by a small group of family and close friends. Her parents were devastated, their grief made worse by the shock of hearing that she had died from cyanide poisoning. As a chemist, I was an obvious suspect in their eyes. They looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and suspicion, finding it hard to believe her death could be anything other than deliberate. Initially, I denied having any part in her death, even to myself. I tried to go on as if life could return to normal. Since we had no children, I was alone in the house we once shared. Without any concrete evidence, the court eventually ruled Emily's death an accident, and no murder charges were filed against me. I avoided any legal consequences, but guilt and paranoia became my constant companions. One afternoon at the lab, Emily's mother, Helen, stormed in. She found me in a hallway where everyone had access. Her eyes blazed with fury, and before I could say anything, she began shouting, her voice echoing down the sterile corridors. "You killed her." "I know it was you, Jake," she screamed, pointing at me accusingly. My colleagues turned to look, their faces masks of confusion and concern. Just then, one of my lab partners, Dr. Ross, approached us. He glanced between Helen and me, frowning. "Jake, I need to talk to you about something," he said. "The vial of cyanide we had in storage, it is missing. You were the last one to access that section. Do you know where it is?" Helen's eyes widened, and a look of realization crossed her face. You see. He did it. He had access to the cyanide. He killed Emily. The tension in the room was thick. I felt the walls closing in on me as Helen's accusations filled the air. My mind raced, scrambling for an explanation. The police had already ruled Emily's death an accident, but this new revelation could reopen the investigation. Helen, I know you are grieving, I said, struggling to keep calm. I understand your pain, but I had nothing to do with Emily's death. The cyanide vial must have been misplaced. I did not take it. Dr. Ross looked skeptical, but before he could say anything, Helen took out her phone and began dialing. I am calling the police. They need to know everything. You are not getting away with this. A wave of panic swept over me. I could not let this escalate. If the police got involved again, they might dig up the truth. I had no intention of going to prison for what had happened, no matter what had driven me to it. Helen, please, I begged, my voice shaky. You need to calm down. This is not helping anyone. But she ignored me, speaking steadily to the emergency operator. Yes, I need to report a murder. My daughter was poisoned by her husband. He used cyanide, and he is right here. My colleagues watched in stunned silence as Helen accused me, and I could see the doubt creeping into their faces, suspicion taking root. The police would be here soon, and I needed to think quickly. My mind raced with possible defenses, ways to explain the missing cyanide and shift any blame. Soon enough, we were all escorted to the police station, the tension thick in the air as we rode in silence. Helen sat beside me, her face a mix of anger and heartbreak. My colleagues were there too, looking both confused and worried. The police separated us for questioning. The interrogation was relentless. The detectives examined every detail of my relationship with Emily, my work at the lab, and the events leading up to her death. I stuck to my story at first, denying any involvement, but the pressure was unbearable. The police were determined to close the case, exploiting every crack in my defense. Hours turned into days, and under the weight of endless questions and accusations, my mental state began to fray. Helen's grief-stricken face haunted me, and my colleagues' quiet betrayal hurt deeply. They all wanted the truth, and denying it was becoming harder by the minute. Finally, the weight of it all broke me. In a moment of despair, I whispered the truth. Yes, I admitted, my voice barely audible. I did it. I poisoned Emily. The room went silent. The detectives exchanged glances before one spoke up. You are admitting to killing your wife with cyanide. I nodded, feeling a mixture of dread and relief. Yes. I used a compound from the lab. It was supposed to cause acne, but something went wrong. They recorded every word of my confession. It was all the judge needed to pass a sentence. The search for further evidence or context was deemed unnecessary. When Helen heard my confession, her face showed both triumph and deep sorrow. My colleagues looked on, expressions a blend of shock and pity. The trial moved quickly, my confession leaving little room for a defense. As I stood before the judge, my heart was heavy with regret. I thought of the chain of events that had led me here, Emily's betrayal, my desire for revenge, and the unintended tragedy that had spiraled out of control. Although my final sentencing had not yet been handed down, I was placed under house arrest, waiting for the inevitable. Each day dragged on as I waited for the knock on my door that would signal the beginning of my imprisonment. The day I was escorted home under guard, I felt a strange sense of acceptance I still cannot fully explain. This is how it all ends, I thought. Perhaps, looking back, simply ending our marriage would have been the wiser path after all.
What do you think about this story? Write in comments. If you don't follow our channel Cheating Room, you will probably never hear from us again. If you are subscribed, congratulations, you will not miss any exciting story. Thank you for listening to this shocking story with us. See you again.
Bye bye.